Well, first, let me say hello, obviously, and welcome to the bright new baby new birth time called New Year's. And this is January 2nd today, 2025. I was writing in my journal the other day thinking 2025 sounds ominous for me. Ominous in both good and bad, dark and light. And I think many things are going to happen this year, 2025. I'm not going to do a big prediction here, other than sounds almost banal to say it's going to be a really tough burning year, and it's going to be a really great awakening year. Today is my third in a series called The History of Transformation. And that word really important to me in my background, going back to the 70s. And it's big and important for humanity going back to, at least in public and more common conversation, back into the probably the late 50s, mid 50s onward. I'm going to read a little section on 1956 and a really wonderful essay on the epilogue to World Perspectives by Ruth Anshin. But in a moment, I also am going to read Brugh Joy's book, Joy's Way, it's called. And that was written in 1979. And Brugh Joy is a doctor who went through a major transformation. He was an MD, surgeon, and became a spiritual teacher of transformation, the transformation process, capitals. He basically developed that model. And so I'm going to read about that. So the history of transformation, just to let you know, is the series of three. So the other two I would highly recommend you have a look at as I'm developing a little bit of this historical background. I'm not trying to be a serious historian here in arcing out the history of transformation, but as far as I can tell, no one has actually written a history of transformation. And that is transformation as an idea, and then transformation as a phenomenon. And that basically the simplest is that transformation is a big change. It's not just a small change. It's like a shift that is so dramatic, like to another level. Some would even maybe say to a quantum leap, to a different way of being in the world, a different understanding of beingness itself and one's identity, to the understanding of what history and evolution is. And it's experiential transformation, and it's also conceptual. So it has a perceptual shift and different understanding that can come. And I say different, big different, right? That's the idea of transformation. It's not just a small difference of change. It is a dramatic difference of change. And some would say to a different structure of consciousness itself. So these are some of the words: consciousness, transformation, but also awakening. And that is the focus for today, third episode. Check out my other videos on the history of transformation. Feel free to leave comments here and enter a discussion with me. But whatever we do, I want you to sit back, grab your tea, juice, whatever in this new year and actually enjoy yourself. I'm going to read to you today, basically. All right. I'm going to start with Ruth Anshin's Anshen, 1956. She wrote the epilogue to a series called World Perspectives. This was really an intellectual powerhouse of really the best thinkers of the time kind of idea in the 1950s, mid 50s, in America and some international. But they gathered, and I'm not sure the exact history of how they gathered. That's not the important thing for today. But I've always really enjoyed that essay, the epilogue, and they were epilogue was stuck into probably five or six books that are in my library that were and are from this World Perspective series. So, in other words, she wrote the final essay summing up what she thought it was that these great thinkers were coming together for and what the purpose is. It's very telling to me that, wow, okay, this is not esoteric transformation ideas about the new age or the new world coming. When I say esoteric, right, the kind of spiritualists and spiritualism ideas and thoughts that have been around in humanity since probably the beginning of shaman thinkers, visionaries, mystics. No. This is just basic, fairly straightforward, best thinkers about the future and about just really strong and powerful ideas about human consciousness and evolution. Where is this process going? So let me just read a few pages. I don't know of Ruth Ashen, 1956, World Perspectives. It is the thesis of world perspectives that man, in his in his process of developing a new consciousness, which in spite of his apparent spiritual and moral captivity, can eventually lift the human race above and beyond the fear, ignorance, and isolation which beset it today. It is to this nascent consciousness, to this concept of man born out of a universe perceived through a fresh vision of reality, that World Perspectives is dedicated. Man, and again, I'm using the language of the 50s. We're talking about humans. Man has entered a new era of evolutionary history, one in which rapid change is a dominant consequence. He is contending with a fundamental change, since he has intervened in this evolutionary process itself. He must now better appreciate this fact and then develop the wisdom to direct the process toward his fulfillment rather than toward his destruction. As he learns to apply his understanding of the physical world for practical purposes, he is, in reality, extending his innate capacity and augmenting his ability and his need to communicate as well, his ability to think and to create. And as a result, he is substituting a goal-directed evolutionary process in his struggle against environmental hardships for the slow but effective biological evolution which produced modern man through mutation and natural selection. By intelligent intervention, therefore, in the evolutionary process, man has greatly accelerated and greatly expanded the range of his possibilities. But he has not changed the basic fact that it remains a trial and error process, with the danger of taking paths that lead to sterility of mind and heart, moral apathy, and intellectual inertia, and even producing social dinosaurs unfit to live in an evolutionary world. Only those spiritual and intellectual leaders of our epoch who have a paternity in this extension of man's horizons are invited to participate in this series, World Perspectives. Those who are aware of the truth that beyond the divisiveness among men, there exists a primordial unit of power, since we are all bound together by a common humanity more fundamental than any unity of dogma. Those who recognize that the centrifugal force that has scattered and atomized mankind must be replaced by an integrating structure and process capable of bestowing meaning and purpose on existence. Those who realize that science itself, when not inhibited by the limitations of its own methodology, when chastened and humbled, commits man to an indeterminate range of yet undreamed consequences that may flow from it. This series endeavors to point to a reality of which scientific theory has revealed only one aspect. It is the commitment to this reality that lends universal intent to a scientist's most original and solitary thought. By acknowledging this frankly, we shall restore science to the great family of human aspirations, humanities, by which men hope to fulfill themselves in the world community as thinking and sentient beings. For our problem is to discover a principle of differentiation and yet relationship lucidly enough to justify and to purify scientific, philosophical, and other knowledge, both discursive and intuitive, by accepting their interdependence. This is the crisis in consciousness, made articulate through the crisis. Excuse me for a sec. This is the crisis in consciousness made articulate through the crisis in science. This is the new awakening. And that goes on for 10 pages more. A really good definition and good exploration and summary of some powerful thinkers. And it ends with awakening. So here in 1956, people are already talking about awakening. So I just want to let you know this is not a New Age concept. It is not a concept of just the spiritual traditions or religious traditions. You can hear she's wanting to mix the sciences, arts, humanities, religion, morals, all in one integrative, unifying knowledge that can help contradict the kind of fragmentation that already in the 50s she's talking about that is and will continue to fragment and cause a lot of destruction. So I'm now going to move on to Brugh Joy to show you the book cover. You can see how he spells the name, and notice it's a map for the transformational journey. And this is an introduction in approaching this transformational process that Brugh Joy defined. And just to say a little about me, and it was in the mid 1980s, and Brugh Joy signed this book I just saw in the probably about 84, 85. And I was living in Olds, Alberta at the time. And I'm not going to go into a long history of that, but I was part of a consciousness community, and one of my friends, Prosper Williams, the late Prosper Williams, a great older man that I met he was near his 80s when I met him in this conscious community. It was my first time in a consciousness community that was very green, very organic, and very much reading these kinds of literatures on transformation and quantum leap, new physics, and so on, the new potentials for humanity. And I was very optimistic at that time. So it was 1980 where I got into that community. By 1984, Prosper said, "You should go to this workshop with me. I really like Brugh Joy." I went to his Sky High Ranch in California, in the desert there, the Mojave Desert in California, and he went years earlier and really enjoyed the Brugh Joy conferences that he used to call them, the transformational process. I was just starting to get more and more. This was when I was cutting my teeth on what is transformation, although I'd been reading bits about it before this time in 1980s. And so thanks to Prosper Williams, and really I'm dedicating this to him and his life and what he did for me and for the community that we lived in Common Ground in Olds, Alberta. More than 500 people now have had this training, he says. Thousands have heard me speak about it in lectures and symposia all over the world. In the process, the conference experience has become clear enough in my mind for me to write about it, and I trust I can make it clearer. I write at this time because I'm at a turning point in my life. While conferences of this transformation process continue to be important to me, I sense that I am about to go through another major transformation, the latest in a long series of them. In a quite literal, though not physical sense, I am dying, and in the same literal sense, I am being reborn. I am leaving my present life and going into a new phase. This book therefore marks an end and a new beginning. Being about the transformational process, it is a sort of cosmology. It is a partial autobiography as well, insofar as my personal transformations have contributed to the development of the subject of this book. And it is a do-it-yourself or how-to book. All my transformations have been of my own choice. I have not lost, but gained in changing from the very orthodox, very respected young physician to the human being now on the verge of giving up his present life. And I wouldn't have had it any other way. You are welcome to come along on the journey as far as you wish and are able. The transformations, the ones I have had, the ones you can have, are what this book is all about. The material is fascinating, terrifying to some people, and quite realistically, not without danger. Very interesting background there of, he says academically he was trained in some of the best schools. He had undergraduate work completed in 1960, the medical school 1964, both at University of Southern California. So yes, he's in California. He's in the west coast of America, early 1960s, right? He's in the 60s, 70s, but he's a straight up medical doctor. He went to Johns Hopkins University for his first year internship and first year residency in internal medicine, 1964 to 66, and to the Mayo Clinic, very famous clinic, for 2 more years of residency in internal medicine. And by 1968, he was out and he was out working on his own. And he goes on to say that he had won many awards and was top notch in his field. Um, he says, all in all, he had what most physicians of his age dream of. What could have ever moved me to, as a physician, to drop it all and venture into the unorthodox and tainted, perhaps downright scandalous areas of spiritual and psychic healing. Period. Question mark. What sent him traveling through Europe, Egypt, India, and Nepal for a period of 9 months? This was a common thing people did back in the 60s and 70s when they dropped out, as we used to call it, or left the stage of normal life and wandered and explored and transformed many times sometimes. And what prompted him to return to the California desert to open a center for people to gather to unfold and share his new ideas? And he says, you are entitled to wonder who are the people who have come there to these conferences in this Mojave Desert on the transformational process. A sampling of the 500 at this time, remember he wrote this in 1979, so he already had 500 people who had come, and then he did this for several years later. I don't know the future after this book, what happened to Brugh Joy. It's something I want to look up at some point. Maybe you know something about it. A sampling of the 500 people would include psychologists, psychiatrists, physicians, nurses, lawyers, accountants, chiropractors, psychics, yoga teachers, business executives, movie and television personalities, housewives, jewelers, marriage and family counselors, social workers, artists, writers, dropouts, drug dealers, prostitutes, and ministers of every major faith. Yeah, okay, that's eclectic. In this diverse group of people, the transformational process brought about deep and fundamental change in each person's perception of reality and in his or her ability to touch, feel, and experience what can only be described as natural, expanded states of consciousness. In that days, the 60s and 70s particularly, but as researchers of consciousness as well today speak of non-consensual states of consciousness, expanded states of consciousness, beyond the normal. Yet he says, natural. That's really important to keep in mind. In this book, I will attempt to express in a collage of words the experience, both internal and objective, that have transformed my life. The many ideas and techniques will be presented in a sequence similar to that of a conference. We will initially develop basic ideas and then move on to greater elaborations and applications. The concepts and techniques are not in historical order in which they occurred to me, but rather in the functional order that I have found most successful in presenting them. I have included the personal autobiographical material merely to illuminate the principles, to show how they developed, not where or when or how they fit into the rest of my life. So it's an autobiography, but it's about principles. It's about the illumination of principles more than about him and his personality. So he doesn't go into a typical autobiography. I really like that. I'm writing my own autobiography right now, and I'm thinking of ideas like this of how I would write it so that, yes, it touches on the typical autobiographic information, but that's not the purpose of the book. And it's much more about a teaching about reality, or what's called the ontology of existence in philosophy. Because events in my reality, in real reality, happen in their own time, their own sequence, their own cause and effect, if any, of cause and effect. So sometimes you couldn't tell cause and effect when you're in different spaces of reality. I am giving this book its head, allowing its structure to unfold as it wishes to unfold. What matters is not the linear sequential ordering of the incidents that have taken part in my transformation, but the new experiential dimensions that come about, where the supposedly solid human body turns out to be an intricate interweaving of energy fields, where disease is not an entity, but rather a fixated warp of energy interactions, where the experience of unconditional love, in capitals, transcends the limitations of personal love, where mortality itself dies and becomes immortality, and where I accept the divine nature of all life forms, simultaneously physical and non physical, structured and non structured, existing and not existing in any particular form at any given moment. So, this is the language you can hear. You should read that. This is someone who has gone through a transformation. They're not speaking in normal speak. He gets to that in a moment as I read further when he starts referring to this is for left brains, not that much. It's really for people who are working and thinking in the right brain and interpreting the world through the right brain, but also through these different levels of consciousness, which one can break into to bring them alive in a way, to light them up as part of your being, capital B, which he talks about being different than small b, human being. Only the rational portion of my consciousness, the left hemisphere, demands sequential information. The non-rational portions find such organization tedious, slow motion, superfluous, perhaps even counterproductive to higher levels of comprehension. So there is a purpose for transformation, for awakening. Higher levels of comprehension. Therefore, each chapter has essential information to transmit that may or may not be related to the immediately preceding or the immediately succeeding chapter. Even paragraphs within a chapter may not be directly related to their neighbors. So this gives me, I'm smiling and I'm writing in the margin, oh, this is how I like to write, in collage style, in what sometimes is called methodological metasage in research and inquiry methods. But it's all very phenomenological as well. Phenomenological being trying to get to the essence of the touching on the non-habitual, non-rigid, structured ideas about what is supposed to be happening in an experience and being rather embedded and then washed over by the experience and then transformed. So he's definitely a phenomenological writer here, which in Ken Wilber's integral aqua model, this would be the upper left quadrant, very much the interior of the individual processing and experiencing, but is a highly, highly relational. So it also touches on the lower quadrants, but very interior for the most part. I think as I read it and I'm scanning through, he'll touch on all the quadrants of Ken Wilber's model. But that's an extraordinary amount. You can look all that up if you wish on Ken Wilber's epistemology. Anyway, he says, enjoy the desultory play of concepts here. He says, but please bear with me. So his writing, again, not fundamentally sequential and normological. And he'll use language, that isn't always understandable. It is only the outer mind that conceives and perceives sequentially. So nowadays we call that the left hemisphere, and he also refers to that right brain, left brain hemisphere thinking for humans has been well researched since the 70s and 80s that I know of, maybe earlier, and then has now resurged with Ian McGilchrist's huge amount of work as a neurobiologist on, I think he's a psychiatrist as well. Yes, has written many books on left brain, right brain that are very powerful, and he's potently showing we're way too left brain in this world that's destroying us. We need to bring back this non-sequential part of our right brain. Our essence here, he says, needs neither time nor sequence. So relax and allow me to unrain the myriad ideas and discoveries I have to share with you. This is great as a writer. He's really inviting us in. I will also not give here a detailed description of who I am and what I am. As this book develops, more of my nature will become apparent. In other words, it'll seep through in the text. To try to present myself in one or two paragraphs, or even a chapter or two, would be ludicrous. No human being can be so described. despite our conditioned beliefs to the contrary. Like you, I am a personal collective. Which of the many trained and untrained personifications of our makeup is displayed in any given moment depends entirely upon the circumstances of that moment. In other words, we can play act to be who we are ourselves, play acting in different conditions in a particular moment. Let me share many moments, show many sides of myself in this book, and something in your awareness will synthesize this information into your own unique perspective of me in this book, just as you would do with anyone in ordinary life. Who or what I am makes no real difference. So as long as the insights I give strike some resonating chords in you, it is not your awareness of me that I intend to influence, but your perception of reality. So when I talked about earlier, what's the purpose of all this? To expand your comprehension of higher realities or more inclusive realities. And here, so that you can develop your own unique, yet there's a universal aspect to expand your perception of reality. That's awakening to multiple and more complex, more inclusive perceptions of reality. Welcome aboard the path of transformation. You will find me equally vague, perhaps irritatingly so, in some of my vocabulary. And you, dear viewer, right now might find some of what I'm saying irritating because it's not getting to the bullet point. I often get critiqued in my talks. Oh, why are you going around and around and there's no bullet points? You could have said in 5 minutes what you said in 35 minutes. Well, screw you too. You're totally not interested and really want to know anything about what I'm trying to teach. You want to know what you want to get. Oh, well, that's not an expanded state of consciousness and awareness. And it's also not a beginner's mind to coming into the learning process. So if you're irritated and annoyed, turn it off. You might come back or you might not. Or pass on the video to someone you think is more patient than you. It's one way to think about it. You will find me equally vague, perhaps irritatingly so, in some of my vocabulary. There is, however, good reason for this vagueness. Part of the transformational process, capital T, capital P, so this is his transformational process, what he's put together all these years, involves going from the left brain, where words are thought to be understood, to the right brain, where they are not. And the right brain doesn't care about understanding words. Not the way the left brain is obsessed by. To talk or to write about phenomena that are beyond the left brain, words are, unfortunately, all we have, and they can only approximate these matters from outside their realm. For just one example, I offer the word beingness, capital B. It looks a lot like the word being, small b, and in fact, it means everything that being, small b, means, and more. Here's the key, and more. Include it, but more. Included, transcended, as Ken Wilber says in Developmental Thinking of Consciousness. And then you're going to be likely on the more truth path. Include, but transcend it. Never get attached to it. Include and transcend it to the next level. Beingness, in the capital sense, is you on all levels of reality. Yeah, swallow that phrase, meditate on that. Among the other odd words and phrases you will find here are the word impress and form nature, because they too are beyond the left brain. These words are truly unidentifiable, and they basically says I'll put those words in italics as we go through. So I'm skipping a little bit here. He also makes a point in that description of his writing and his work. I am not here to try and prove to you this is true. His experience shows it is true. And that's an experience that comes from 500 plus participants in these very intense, usually a week long or more, basically being in circle, encountering. And he takes people through a lot of practices and does it very improvised, he says. Um, so he's not apologizing that he's not here to try and lay out a proof scheme. It's more one you have to deal with and decide how scientific is this? How much is it important as a metaphysics, as a religion? Is it psychiatry? Is it sociology? Is it psychology? What's going on here? But he says all of those ways of knowing, philosophy, law, politics, economics, and so on, each tries to organize reality into coherent patterns of hypotheses called theories, creeds, dogmas, laws, and beliefs. In truth, all are merely ideas about life. All fail to stress their basically hypothetical nature. In other words, they fail to tell you those fields of knowing, knowledge, dogmas, doctrines, disciplines. They fail to tell you that, hey, we have found all this, but take it with a grain of salt. Yeah, they're not that self-critical. They're not that reflective of themselves. They find it really hard to stand back and say, well, maybe we don't have all the truth. In fact, we don't, but you can include some of this, what you think might be best, and include it with other things that you find best, and you will come to your own. No, disciplines do not do that. And then religions don't do that because they want dogma to portray, to be the hegemonic dominant order of this is the truth. So that's where you get absolute truths. And that can be religious sacred. That can be pushing absolute truth through ideologies, through secular as well. Now, this is what I find a really important, fundamental part to the transformation process, or what he calls also awakening. The release out of the hypothetical foundations on which all systems of belief rest is the crux of the transformational process. We start out entrapped in hypotheses, these stories we tell ourselves of what is, that we believe to be absolute truths. Then in our transformation, we see that they are only temporary structures capable of teaching only relative truths, and for that matter, that the relative truths are true only in the context of their organizing ideation. The transformation opens vistas of human awareness that cannot be comprehended from any one particular perspective. So this is the moment of you start to realize as you shift your consciousness, this paradigm of consciousness, this awakening process of consciousness, this evolving of consciousness. It can do different things at higher levels. All of them are important, what it can do. But there will be this place where you begin to realize it's all hypothetical. What that tells you, who tells you, where, what. Doesn't mean it's wrong, doesn't mean it's all bad. Doesn't mean it's just relative and everything's nihilistic. No, 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 no. That's a very misinterpretive view of what transformational awakening is about. Transformation enlarges the context of reality. It has us let go of those ones that we want to hold on to as the truth. The awareness, therefore, of ourselves is uplifted into states of consciousness where the multi-dimensional nature of existence is perceived. See, it's not mono-dimensional anymore. Not just conceived either as an idea in thinking, but where it is experienced, not just imagined either. See, experienced is not just imagined, but where we experience for real, where each dogma and each absolute truth is seen through as but only a single facet of a superconscious whole called beingness, capital B. In the totality of beingness, there is no absolute anything, no rights or wrongs, no higher or lower aspects, only the infinite interaction of forces, subtle and gross, that have meaning only in relationship to one another. This doesn't mean you let go of right and wrong, making choices as a human being in this life, in this world, in this context, in this body. It's got nothing to do with letting all that right and wrong go. You include that right wrong making, but you transcend it and do not become so absolutely attached to it, where you'll actually kill people who do not agree with your right. And they think you're wrong, you think they're wrong. That's not an awakening of consciousness. That is not a transformed, that's very normal. Unfortunately, has become the stable and accepted norm for how to move ahead in this world, and it's not working all that well. Thus, why do people set up experiments like this for transformational processes? Because we have to change the way we think, to be blunt. But it's also how we experience the world, not just about thinking and conceptual, right? He says experienced. In the totality of beingness, capital B, there is no absolute anything, no rights or wrongs, no higher or lowers aspects, only the infinite interaction of forces, subtle and gross, that have meaning only in relationship to one another. So it's a very relational ontology here. Again, it's not about an individual self looking out at the world and objectively identifying that, there, this, naming that, and the subject is removed from the object. So we get a blending, right? A dissolving of the subject-object barrier in perception. Absolutes or concoctions is what you start to see. They're made up. They're constructed. They're made up and constructed in contexts. And that is the fundamental part of the awareness and awakening that happens. And that happens in postmodern thought as well, by the way. Just awakening from a modernist perspective on reality to a postmodernist perspective on reality, where construction and contextualization, and there's a more complex one called aperspectival vision logic. These all evolve when you start moving into the postmodern and postmodern levels of consciousness and awareness. Reality must never be confused with concoctions. That's a pretty important sentence. Probably the most important one I've read so far. Reality must never be confused with concoctions. The map is not the territory. The hypothesis is not the truth. It's a way to the truth. Map's useful. It's a way to the truth of the territory, but it's not the territory. So when you really start to get that, then you're looking for and experiencing and open to and willing to experience, let go of some of those maps, those preconditioned ideas, right? And really get into the territory of reality. It's much more complex than the concoctions, I can tell you. And the concoctions in my research are fear-based. I think he will get to that definitely as in this book, but I'm not going to read all that. This is going to be a long enough video now. I'm going to just find a few more things to read and then we'll close up. Reality must never be confused with concoctions. The transformational process, the release from fixed beliefs, allows the fragmented awareness to meld into universality. So there's the direction. What's the purpose of doing all this? Expanded states of consciousness, expanded ideas of perceived reality, not just ideas, but actually experiences. But it's both, also ideas. That's why thinking is still important. It's not we're throwing our mind out here. You still are a critical thinker, still have concepts, still have arguments, but it's left and right brain working together, not either or dominating. And that we're moving toward a melding into universality. So even though we see all this relative truth, we actually move further and further and deeper into an essence of a universality of truth. So this is where people who are so afraid of the relativism of postmodernism, I mean, terrified of it. They want to get back to universals, but they want to use pre-modern universals or modern universals. And this is not, that approach is not in direction with the evolution of consciousness. It's not in direction of world perspectives, as Ruth Anshen's talking about. We have to be willing to work at that progressive edge, overcome our fears, and not just loop back and try to get back to the retro, regressive ways. We're holding on to what's familiar and safe and feels like it's universal, and therefore we're not so afraid, apparently. You feel safer. Well, he talks about it, and he talks about energy fields. Everything starts to move into energy. He talks about chakra centers and what he's learned there, not just from concepts, but traveling in the East. Obviously, doing lots of dream work, he says, lots of meditation. He's not talking about doing drugs, but maybe he has done some psychotropics. Let me just read the last couple paragraphs. Those individuals who have not worked, here's his warning. Well, at first he says tapping these energies, extraordinary, non consensual, is a radical departure from what is, for most of us, usually normal. Tapping these energies is fire, and consequences are serious and can be dangerous. So I'm ending this with his cautionary, not fear mongering. He's cautioning for some people are ready for this work of transformation and awakening. Some people are not. Some people, the transformation and awakening process sort of explodes and happens. Remember, he said early pages, every transformation I made was my choice. That is not the case for every individual. It was for him. It pretty much has been a lot for me, although some of what I've experienced in transformations has been kind of exploded into me. And some people are literally blown out of their minds through a mystical, spiritual awakening of beingness and reality. But it's hard to integrate that with the rest of reality. So here's where he says those individuals who have not worked through ego trips or power trips, which are concoctions about how important you think you are, yourself, your ego, your privilege, and all those power trips that go with that, in relation to other human beings, and those individuals who cannot allow sweeping changes to occur in their lives as a consequences of coming into contact with the information about this transformational process. These people should not attempt the techniques described in this book of awakening, of transformation. Every soul is responsible for its own existence and experience. Part of the maturation is the ability to draw the honesty cards, he says, about oneself to the forefront of one's awareness. So transformation a lot is about becoming honest with yourself and your biases in perception, your limitations in awareness and reality, and your contraction instead of expansion and choices you made on that contraction in a fear-based way. So I would he says that to become and draw these honesty cards, he's just using it as a metaphor, about oneself to the forefront of one's awareness in order to decide upon a course of action and the timing of that action. The consequences of immature judgment, ego trips, power trips, just being immature, of just toying with and playing with chakra energy systems, ideas, and realities, phenomenon, can lead to psychoses, aggravation of neuroses, acceleration of disease processes, and even suicide. But the awakening in certain states of consciousness, non-normal, right, in that sense, can bestow such gifts of great value that are beyond price. Gifts such as the mastery of any or all of the PSI phenomenon, psychic phenomenon, healing powers, not yet recognized by conventional Western science, and deep serenity, wisdom, and a knowledge of life. Thank you, Brugh Joy. There's a wonderful book on transformations because this is about the history of transformation. I think in one of my earlier videos in the episodes 1 and 2 on the history of transformation, there is a holding up of the book by Ken Wilber, Engler and Brown, 1985, Transformations of Consciousness, it's called. And they study both the positive and the pathologies of each levels and structures of transformation. So very detailed. very well researched and profoundly important if you're a real serious student of transformation. You see not just its history historically and how it's been constructed, ideas of transformation, what people have experienced, that's all important. But there's also the developmental and evolutionary history of transformation, which occurs within our psychic, mental, mind, and beingness structures. And I'm using structures very loosely here, very lightly, very dissolved, very porous ideas of structure that most of us don't even, it's so subtle, we don't even believe it's a structure. So oftentimes we can just call it energies or levels or stages, states, but they are identifiable. This is what I'm saying. There's a lot of research been done, and a lot of it started in the ancient East, where they really mapped these levels of consciousness and these transformations. See, it's ancient, but as I'm saying, in the West, 1956, as I read Ruth Ashen on this, expanding our world perspectives, we have to shift. That's what that whole series was about. We knew this by the 50s in the West. We're very resistant to it. We wanted to forget it, and we forgot a lot of it about shifting perspectives from more body centered, somatic centric to ego centric, tracking out an evolutionary developmental schema here. And they, of course, have historical, cultural relations with history itself. It's the history of consciousness. And then from somatic to egocentric to sociocentric and ethnocentric, and then to world centric, which is the one we're really trying to break into and have been at least since the 1950s in the West. We're trying to develop who's we. Well, certainly the consciousness explorers, the awakening and awakened ones, more or less. But awakening is a lifelong process. It's not ended at some point. Keep that in mind. So it's not some great achievable, oh, aren't I wonderful? And so power in the ego is so you can come in and say, oh, I'm higher, I'm awakened. You're not. I'm enlightened. You're not. That's when you know you've been deeply sidetracked in your spiritual journey, call it your transformational journey. And that's why maps of the transformation process are so important. So today was a celebration of Brugh Joy and his book on the maps, a map for transformation, which is based on his experiences, as I say, from working with 500 plus people in these intense workshops, conferences he calls, from his dreaming, from his intuitive, but not just imagined. So get it out of your mind if you think, oh, he's just imagining all this. Well, that's very gross to assume until you actually go in and read the book, number one. But number two, actually, preferably go to his workshops. But of course, he's probably not living in, would probably be well into his 80s, 90s by now. But the whole idea is other people are doing these too as transformational change projects, experiments, experiences. A lot of people are taking ayahuasca today or magic mushrooms, psilocybin, and other forms to have these expanded states, right, appear, to go through these transformation processes. But most of what I've participated in with Brugh Joy, and I was in it was an 8 or 10 day conference in Banff in Alberta, Canada, in the mountains, and I was 30 years old plus a little. And there I was doing this. And we walked through and he did many of his exercises that he does. And he did that with probably 150 participants in this big, huge room, day after day after day after day, experiences after experiences. And that's just reminding me. I will end with his quote on awakening. I think I can find it in chapter 1, which I hadn't got to yet, but he talks about basic concepts. The subtle exploration into the obvious is the awakening process. And I thought, wow, wouldn't that be great if that was the foundation of education itself? The subtle exploration into the obvious is the awakening process. That is the teaching, learning process. That is what education is all about in essence. All the content, all the things we learn, reading, writing, arithmetic, blah, 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 all these disciplines and subjects, all these hypotheses about reality that we learn in schools, that's fine. You can teach those. But if you lose the subtle exploration into the obvious, is the awakening process. If you lose that and the children don't know why they're learning all this other than to get a job or, pleases mom and dad or the teacher and you get A's and shiny gold stars. If they've lost the idea and the word itself of awakening is the purpose of education, you've basically lost those children in a wilderness, darkness, shadow, the denied from reality. They are living in a pseudo reality. Not good, because you will not be in touch with reality when you need it to solve the problems we need to solve in this world of great crises cascading. They are reality crises that we face today. The good news is we can transform our processes of knowing reality and our beingness participating in those realities. And the argument is we will be much more universal, cooperative, agreeable, capable of working a lot more peacefully together. Not in total harmony, there's always going to be conflict. So I think a lot of those will add up to this is why transformation is important. I might do a history of transformation for it. We'll see in the series, but I'm really glad to do this today. Glad you could join me.